Carry on with there is a sound, and I'm going to continue on in 1 Kings chapter 18, and I'm still kind of figuring out how the Lord wants me to work all this together, because there's a lot of things that the Lord's been telling me this past week. But Elijah, at this point in Elijah's journey, it's been 3 years and some change since God has called Elijah out. When he called him, we've talked about it when he said he went up to Ahab and he stopped the rain in Israel. And it's been 3 years and some change since Elijah's been called out, and now God has prepared him during this time. And the title of this message is The Sound of Preparation. Because a lot of times, when I was talking about there is a sound, or the sound, a lot of times we think of, there's a sound of, and I almost called this, there's a sound, the sound of provision. Because provision has a sound, but oftentimes it's preceded by the sound of preparation. So oftentimes when you look at a storm that's coming, the provision of the rain has not yet made it, but there's the sound of the preparation of a storm that's coming. You hear what I'm saying? So a lot of times there's a sound to preparation, and God's used a lot of things to reveal this to me this past week, and I always use stuff that I watch on TV, and God always speaks to me through TV shows and movies and different stuff like that. Well, I've been hooked on this show called Forged in Fire. I don't know how many of y'all have ever seen that, but it's a blacksmithing show, and they build knives and swords and things of that nature. And I was so fascinated by this show, just the technique and just how these guys could take this metal and just turn it into, it's really quite incredible, some of the stuff that they can make out of this. And the more I watched it, I began to feel this connection to it, not on a physical level, but on a spiritual level. I began to see some things, and sometimes when we feel like, one of the things I love is when all these people show up, and they're well-known blacksmiths. They're really good at their trade. They've been doing it for several years. They are trained, and they show up, and they're like, all right, the challenge is you got to take this. One of them was a car. It was like an old junky car, and they're like, you got to take something from this junky car and turn it in to a knife of your, style or whatever. And all of them are like, oh, Lord, I never thought that I'd have to do something like this. But nonetheless, they take pieces from this thing and they forge it into a knife. And a lot of times I think that is what people feel about themselves. They feel like they're just an old junk car, like they have no use, like they have no value, like they can't be used for anything. A lot of people have this mindset. And as I was watching that particular episode, this is what the Lord began to speak to me, was that he said, there are a lot of people that feel that way, that feel like they can't be used, that feel like they're no good. He said, but I'm the best blacksmith there ever was. So I can take something that you think is junk, and I can turn it into something that has a purpose. A knife has many purposes, but I wasn't so focused on the knife as much as I was focused on that it had a purpose. And because these guys took it, and I'm going to tell you something, it's not always easy. Okay, it's not an easy process that this metal goes through and that the blacksmith goes through. You hear what I'm saying? There's two different ends of this thing. Because what they do is they take this metal and they put it in the fire. You ever felt like you was in the fire? Like God was burning you up, or like your situations were just burning your hide up? Oftentimes, and my wife not too long ago, she told me this, we was talking about the harvest. And a lot of times people think that the harvest, they've done all the work. They've plowed everything up. They've planted the seed. They've done all the hard stuff. The harvest is the fun part, right? The harvest is actually the hardest part, because guess what? The corn ain't going to pick itself. The potatoes aren't going to pull themselves out of the ground. Carrots aren't, all this stuff that you grow, it's not going to pick itself. It's not going to prepare itself. You hear what I'm saying? It's not going to distribute itself. It's not going to cook itself. So a lot of times, the thing that we think is hard, and actually she looked up the Greek word for harvest, and it actually means the heat. So a lot of times when you think you're in the heat, it's because there's a preparation coming. There's something, God's preparing to do something with you. And you know what? And when you get pulled out of the heat, sometimes you're going to get put on the anvil, and He's going to start forging you. He's going to, you hear what I'm saying? And sometimes you'll get stretched and you'll get molded. And you know, it's not an easy process. And sometimes we're like, oh my God, why is this happening to me? You know, it's hot. It's hot in here right now. Matter of fact, I feel like I'm in the forge right now. Praise Jesus. He's molding us this morning. So anyway, so they go through this process of forging, and a lot of times when it's all said and done with, if y'all have ever seen this, I mean, it is amazing. They make this knife, and when it's all said and done with, I mean, it's usually a beautiful knife. And they'll take it and they put it through these tests to test its durability, how strong it is, how sharp it is. You know, and man, the Lord began to tell me, He said, you know what? Sometimes when I forge you, when I work you, when I put you in the heat, or when you get put in the heat, it's because I'm molding you. I'm shaping you into something that whenever the tests come and they begin to test your strength and they begin to test your sharpness, you will be able to withstand the blows. You'll be able to, you hear what I'm saying? You'll be able to keep your form whenever things get hard. Man, whoever thought that forged in fire could preach, But the Lord began to tell me, He said, sometimes, people need to be reminded that there is a sound to preparation. Because when you get pulled out of the fire and He goes to forging, if you've ever heard it, it's loud. Ping, ping. They're beating on this piece of metal and it's loud, and then they take it to a grinder and grinding, making all. There's a sound to preparation. But oftentimes the sound of preparation is letting you know that there is a provision that is on its way. There's something coming after the preparation. So not only is there a sound to preparation, there's a sound to provision. But you got to know that if you're hearing the sound of preparation in your life, if you're feeling like you're in the fire, you're feeling like you're on the anvil getting beat up by everything in the world, it's because you're being formed. So when the time comes, your provision will be there. You'll be strong enough to stand the test. You'll hold your form. You'll keep your sharpness. Amen? So people need to be reminded that, just when you feel like you're junk, just when you feel like you can't be used, God is the best blacksmith in town, and He can turn you to anything that has a purpose. He can use you for His purpose, and people need to be reminded of that. There's a sound to preparation. And what I kind of want to talk about this morning was Elijah. He had been through this season of preparation. And we've talked about it the past couple of weeks. He'd been through this season of preparation. 3 years and some months he's been in preparation. And now has come the time for what God has forged him into to be tested. So that's why I say, I wanted to talk about the harvest, because a lot of times we think that, once the preparation's done, the provision is the easy part. The provision is just as hard as the preparation, because you have to be in a place to where you can receive the provision. If you can't receive it, then what good is it for you? You hear what I'm saying? You have to be able to receive the provision. So Elijah, he gets ready. He comes out and he confronts Ahab, who was, if you remember, was like one of the worst kings that had ever ruled over Israel. And all of Israel were worshiping these false gods. And so it actually come up in 1 Kings 18, verse 19. This is what it says. It says, now, therefore, Elijah had come to this place, and he's telling Ahab, he's telling all the people, he says, now, therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. That is 850 prophets, verses 1. Y'all ever seen Hunger Games? May the odds be ever in your favor. Because that, you know what I mean? That don't line up for me. You know, 850 to 1, that ain't fair. That ain't fair. But you know what? When I read this passage of Scripture, Elijah understood something. He wasn't concerned because, as a matter of fact, he called them out. He said, bring all 450 and 400 of these. You bring all of them. He said, because it doesn't matter if it's 850 versus 1 or not. Because my God is greater than yours. You hear what I'm saying? My God is bigger than the number of people that you have. Sometimes we feel outnumbered. Sometimes we feel like the world's we're just surrounded by enemies and we're the only one in the middle. We feel like we're surrounded by 850 enemies and we're just stuck right in the middle. But I want to tell you something, that if your enemies are circling you, that means your God is circling your enemies. They may not see it and they may not know it, but if there's 850 of them, there's 851 of God's army on the other side of them. You're always in the favor of God. You're always on the winning side. We need to be reminded that, hey, you know what? Sometimes it looks like I'm outnumbered. Sometimes it looks like I'm going to be beat. But God has forged me into something that can withstand the test, that can withstand the trial. And I know that my forge, my blacksmith, the one that's on my side, I know that he's greater than those that come against me. Y'all know what I'm doing? I'm preaching. That's what I'm doing. I'm preaching. So he goes on, he calls out all these prophets because you know what? He's getting ready to make a statement about God. He's getting ready to make a statement about the power of his God in his life. And sometimes I think that is what we need to do. Your problems and your situations and your circumstances that have been holding you back, you need to call them out. You need to say, I'm calling you out because I'm fixing to demonstrate the power of my God in my life. You hear what I'm saying? This is the place we need to be. We can learn a lot from Elijah about his mindset, his perspective, the way he viewed God. So he goes on and all of this transpired. They brought all of the prophets up there. They brought everybody up there. And they're up there, and I'm not going to go through reading all of it, but they bring these 2 cows up there, and, they're saying, look, you build an altar for your gods, and I'll build one for mine, and we'll, prepare these cows, and whatever God comes down, and basically cooks the cow, cooks the meat, that'll be how we know. So he's prepared this test to prove the power of his God in his life and in the lives of his people. He's trying to get them to see. And so guess what? So here's what happens. All these prophets, all 850 of them, they show up and they're up there. I don't know what they do. The rain dance, the fire dance, whatever dance they do, I don't know. They're all up there around their altar trying to call Baal and their gods to come down and answer them and do all this stuff. How many of you know that is the same thing that your problems are doing? They can't beat you, so therefore they're trying to call on somebody that's already been defeated. I wish somebody helped me preach up in here. Your problems and your situations know that they cannot win. So therefore they will sit there and try to distract you and try to keep you from calling on your God as long as they can. Because they're trying to convince you that if I could just convince him to not call on his God, if I could just convince him just a little while longer while I divert him, distract him. But see, Elijah, and this is the point we got to get to. Elijah, it said that at noon, in verse 27, it said, and at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a God. You'll notice the G is lowercase. He's not referring to them as an actual God. He said, for he is a God. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awake. And he said, I don't know what your God's doing. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Maybe he's taking a leak. Who knows? Keep calling on him if you want to. He's not going to show up. That's what Elijah's telling them. He's mocking them. So see, a lot of times I think what we got to do is when our problems and our situations arise in our lives and we begin to call those things out, we've got to begin to mock them. We've got to begin to say, you know what? I don't care how big and bad you think you are. You're not going to win. You're not going to beat me. You're not strong enough for me. You don't know who forged me. You don't know what I'm made of. You hear what I'm saying? I'm made of the one who created all things. It says the Spirit of the living God lives in me. I have His very own Spirit. I've been made by Him. Whenever I received Him into my life, it said anyone that receives Him, they would be made a what? New creation. It doesn't say that He took your old and made it beautiful again. He said, I've made you brand new. Brand new. I've made you into something new. I took something that was nothing and made it into something. You hear what I'm saying? People need to know that they have been made into something, that they have a purpose, that you know what, just because there's 850 verses 1 doesn't mean that you lose. As a matter of fact, 850 verses 1, that gives me all the more time to boast in the power of God. You hear what I'm saying? Because that's the only way you're going to win. It's through God. So a lot of times, you know, we get put into these situations or we come into these situations not so that we can see how strong we are, but so God can show you how strong He is. Because a lot of times we're too focused on ourselves that we miss out. And a lot of times when we get focused on ourselves, that's when things become chaotic. And that's when things don't seem to work. And that's when we begin to feel like we're failures. And that's when you hear what I'm saying? I could go on and on with a list of things that we feel as just as people when we begin to focus on ourselves. But sometimes, have you know, you'll step into a situation and you'll be like, there's no way. I can't do this. And that is the time when God says, I know you can't, but I can. You know what I'm saying? Now I've got to walk by faith. You know what I'm saying? Now I've got to believe and trust and know that whenever God has called me to do something, no matter what the odds look like, I'm still going to win. Not because I'm there, but because He's there. So He began to mock them. So, you know, I believe that sometimes you've got to turn it on your problems and your situation. And you got to begin to look your problems and your, whatever it is you're going through in your life. And you got to be like, you know what? Where you at? What you got? You ain't got nothing for me. I ain't studying you. You ain't got nothing for me. You think that if you distract me long enough that I won't call God down and He won't remove you from my life. Too late for that, because I'm calling on Him. You hear what I'm saying? We've got to begin to learn to call on God. And you know, that's what He wants. He wants us to call on Him. He wants us to say, you know what, God, this situation is too tough for me. I don't know how to get through. I don't know what the next step is. I don't know what the provision is in this season. He wants us to get focused back on Him. Amen? So he goes on, and Elijah goes on, and he does his thing. And he calls God. He calls on God, and God shows up. And when God shows up, fire comes down, hits the cow, cooks all the meat, does all the stuff, and all the people are sitting there. You hear what I'm saying? All of a sudden, the distraction of the prophets is now gone because God has showed up. And let me tell you something. When God shows up, people's attention gets changed because they're all focused on the lie. I think that's a good way to put it. Baal and these other prophets, they were a lie. They were what was false. And all of the nation of Israel were focused on the lie. They were focused on the false. You know what? And sometimes I believe that we get to that place. Sometimes I believe, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't pretend to walk around like I'm holier than thou all the time. You know, I had somebody call me a man of the cloth the other day. I'm like, look, you need to calm down with all that. Ain't no need for name calling. All right. I'm going to tell you what I am. I'm a believer who's still going through a process. That's what I am. I'm a believer who's still going through a process, sometimes even myself included, but a lot of us will believe, and we get to this place to where we believe and we focus on the lie and the things that are false. And when we do that, we lose sight of the truth. And so what has to happen is we have to get to this place like Elijah did, where you allow God to show up. And see, when God showed up, when Elisha called him and fire come down and all this stuff happened, if you read in verse 39, it says this, it says, and when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. So see, what happens is when God shows up, it automatically doesn't only fix your perspective, it begins to fix everybody's perspective around you. Because people begin to see you and they begin to say that if you can overcome that problem or that situation or that circumstance, if you can overcome it the way you did, then surely He is God. Because I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of things that we've been through, and whether or not we've been aware of it or not, there's a lot of things that we've been through that we only made it through it because He is God. Now, whether or not we was aware of it was a different story. Now, it may be one of those things when you look back in your past, because a lot of times it's often easier to see God at work when you look in reverse. Anybody ever done that? You look back and you're like, I know the only way I made it is because God had to have been there. There's no way I made it any other way. God had to be there. I would not have made it if He wasn't. So they said that, and then verse 40 it said, and Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon and slaughtered them there. The reason I wanted to put this in there is because you need to take that which is false. You need to take the lie. You need to take those things that have been opposing you, those things that have been trying to rise against you, those things that have been trying to distract you from getting closer to God. You need to take those things and you need to seize them. You need to capture them and you need to destroy them. Because when you destroy something, how do you know it cannot come back? Scripture makes this I think it says it pretty clear. That which was meant to destroy me, He will use to deliver me. But how do you know that I can't get deliverance if that which is trying to destroy me is still around? Sometimes the only way you can be set free from something is when you capture it and you destroy whatever it is that's been keeping you from getting closer to God. Whatever it is. I mean, we could go through a list, and I'm sure right now if you were to sit and think about what is one thing in your life that has kept you from getting closer to God. What is one thing that you could capture right now? What's one lie that maybe you've believed that you could capture right now and destroy it and be set free from it? And do we believe it? Do we believe that God would show up and take away those things that are trying to keep us from Him? That's a challenge. Do we believe it? Do you believe it? Elijah goes on in verse 41. Elijah says this to Ahab. He says, go up, eat and drink. For what? There is the sound of rushing of rain. There's the sound of the rushing of rain. And Elijah has been through a time of preparation. He's been tested. God has showed up and proven to the people that He has brought Elijah forth. And Elijah begins to tell him, he said, you know what? We've been through the season of preparation, but now comes the season of provision. Amen. Go, Justin. Yeah. Preach, preacher! My preacher's on fire! Sorry, I had to pump myself up a little bit. Excuse me while I celebrate. But he said, go up, eat and drink. He said, for there is a sound of rushing rain. So, I love this thing about the sound, because oftentimes we think that, well, now that I've been through this, there automatically is a provision at the other end of it. Sometimes you will hear it before you see it. Elijah heard something over 3 years ago that the Lord had told him to do. So he heard it, and he had to wait 3 years, and I believe it's 6 months or 8 months or something of that, somewhere around in there. But he had to wait almost 4 years before he actually saw what God had called him to do. 4 years of preparation. That's a long time. That is a long time. But Elijah finally hit this place, and he said, you know what? I've been hearing the sound of preparation for 3 years and 6 months, or 3 years and 8 months. I've been hearing this sound of preparation this whole time. He said, but now that we've been through what we've been through the time of testing, we've been through all this stuff. He said, all of a sudden, the sound has begun to change in my life. The sound has begun to change to the nation of Israel. The sound has begun to change to your life and to the people around you. He said, now I'm hearing the sound of provision. He said, now I'm no longer hearing that sound of preparation. I'm now hearing the sound of provision. Things are fixing to change. There's a sound of the rushing rain that's coming. Go, Justin. Yeah. Wow. Preach. Man, I'm preaching good. Go ahead on, Pastor. So he told him to go up. So Ahab, he went. And he began to do these things, and then in verse 43, and here's the thing that I wrote down in my Bible. Here's the thing that Elijah began to do when he began to declare. He said, hey, there is the sound of a rushing rain that's coming. You know what he began to do in the minds of the people that were hearing him speak? He began to unblock their minds from the thing that has kept them from receiving the provision. He said, because you've been so focused on this part that you ain't hearing what's over here. You're not hearing the sound of the provision. So what he begins to do, he said, you know what? I'm going to begin to unblock it. And I love the fact that he used rain. And even though it was natural, physical rain that came, but even for us today, when we begin to look at the symbolism behind water, what happens is sometimes we build up these dams in our lives where we stop the flow of the Holy Spirit. And we stop Him from working in certain areas of our lives. But what Elijah's saying, he said, you know what? There's the sound of the rushing of rain that's coming. And I believe that that is a very relevant word for today. There is the sound of a rushing rain, of a rushing water that's coming to you in your life. And then in verse 43, he goes on, he said to his servant, he said, go up now, look toward the sea. And his servant went up and he looked and said, there's nothing. Anybody ever done that? There's a sound, let me go check it out. There's nothing over here. God, I thought you said there was a sound. There is a sound. Sometimes you'll, hear it before you see it. And sometimes we'll run to try to see it before it's time to be seen. And then when we don't see it, we turn away and walk away from it. Are you hearing what I'm saying? Sometimes you won't even realize it, but you'll turn and walk away from your provision because it didn't show up when you thought it ought to show up. So what he says here, he tells his servant, he said, there's nothing. And he said, go again. 7 times, he told him. Could you imagine? Just imagine if you were at a top of, 3 flights of stairs and God was like, hey, the sound's coming from the bottom of them steps. And you run all the way down there and you're like, there's nothing. You run all the way back up. God, there's nothing down there. No, go back 7 more times. You serious? You serious right now? Sometimes that's what we do. We don't want to go back to where He's told us the provision was coming from. We don't want to go back. But some of the best things and some of the greatest provisions will happen in your life when you go back and you look at them again. When you go back and you continue to look and look and look, even when you can't see it, but you hear the sound, you know it's there. You better keep going back until you see something begin to happen, because if there's a sound, there's a provision. And he goes on in verse 44. Maybe not. I lied. 44, and it says, and the seventh time he said, behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea. How many of you know that sometimes your provision is not going to look like it's a grand old provision when you first see it? You've been hearing the sound. You know, if you look at a storm cloud that's way off, oh, I'm finna get deep. When you look at a storm cloud that's way off, you know, it may be the biggest storm cloud you've ever seen. But if you look at it way off, your perspective about that cloud is that that provision is small. But how do you know that the closer the storm, the cloud, the closer that provision gets to you, the bigger it begins to look? Are you hearing what I'm saying? So sometimes you have to sit there and you have to be focused on the provision. You have to be focused on what God's sending to you. Because right now it may be way off and it may look small to you, but you don't understand that your perspective right now about the provision is not right. Because when it gets close to you, have anybody ever experienced this? When you look at a storm cloud coming and it may not look very big, and then all of a sudden it shows up and it's like covered the whole city, you know, and you're like, oh my God, where did this come from? It come from over there. Exactly where God was sending it. You know what I'm saying? So sometimes we look off and we're like, oh, there's the little provision. It's way out there. A little. How's that going to help me? Keep focused on the provision. And the closer you get to God, the closer you get to Him, and the closer you get to your provision, the bigger it is in your life. That's good. And then he goes on, and then, you know, he talked about the cloud coming from the sea. And then in verse 46, I put this in here. He told Ahab, he said, hey, he said, go and prepare your chariot. I didn't put these scriptures over here. He said, but go and prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you. He said, and in a little while, the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And then it said this. It says in verse 46. It says, and the hand of the Lord was on Elisha. And he gathered up his garments and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Sometimes, you know, when I heard this passage of Scripture, what immediately would come to me was what Isaiah talked about. He said, I'll run and I'll not be weary. Paul talks about running your race. He said, all I know is that I've been set here to run my race. And I'm running my race and I ain't stopping till I get to the end. You hear what I'm saying? There's a lot of stuff in the scriptures that talks about running a race and talks about running and not being weary. How many of you ever tried to run across the parking lot? If I tried to run outside this building, I would be weary before I hit the front doors. When we focus on our own abilities, that's when you become weary. When you focus on what you think you can do, that's when you become weary. That's when you feel like you can't finish your race. That's when you feel like giving up. Anybody ever been there? I've been there. I felt like throwing the towel in on what God called me to do several times. But when I get to this place, when I begin to fix my perspective and I begin to see that the provision for me and what God's called me to do is a lot greater than I thought it was. I thought it was small. But now the closer I've gotten to Him, I realize, hey, the provision is much bigger than I thought it was. I can't do this on my own. I can't do this, in my own power. And what I love about this is that it said Ahab was actually on a chariot, guys. He was riding a horse, for Christ's sake. Okay? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I couldn't even think about it. Imagine trying to run with a horse. You know, smack a horse on the rear end and then you try to take off and keep up with it and see how far you make it. You ain't going to make, I know I ain't going to make it far. But the most fittest person in this place ain't going to make it very far. But what happened was Ahab was on this chair and he said, go back, go towards Jezreel. And then it said, the hand of the Lord all of a sudden, once Elijah had grabbed a hold of the provision that God had given him, you know what I'm saying? When you begin to grab hold of the provision that God's given you, it said all of a sudden the hand of the Lord was on Elijah and he was able to defy what most people think could never be done. I want to tell you that Elijah outrun a dadgum horse in a chariot. It said that he ran ahead of Ahab. I would have loved to have been there to see that. Couldn't you see Elijah just grab his robes up? Because that's what they had. That's what they had. You seen Elijah reach down. He said, it's time to go. Grab my robe up. And he just took off. I could just see little dust trails coming off Elijah's feet as he was running. Because he was getting it all of a sudden. When he grabbed a hold of his provision, all of a sudden things become real clear to him. He knew exactly where to run. He knew exactly how to go. And he ran and he didn't get weary. Because he wasn't running in his own provision. He was running in the provision of God. And that's the only way you're ever going to make it, is when you continue to run in the provision that God's given you. If you ever try to run in your own provision, you will not make it. That's the only reason Elijah was able to do what he was able to do. And the only way that you're ever going to be able to defy the things that tell you you can't do it is when you begin to run in the provision that God has sent you. Oh, just man, I'm gonna have to get me something on the computer that's got like a roaring stadium or something that we can turn on, because man, I'm preaching so good. I know the people online are shouting. I know they're shouting. So I want to encourage you to unblock it this morning. Whatever is in your life that's been blocking the provision, whatever's been blocking the flow of water, the flow of the Spirit in your life this morning, I want to encourage you. You can do it right now. You can do it when you leave. I don't care when you do it, but you need to do it. You need to unblock the flow of the Spirit in your life. And you know what? Whatever you thought wasn't there, when you begin to hear that sound, you've all heard it. God's already told you. I know He has. God's already told all of you that there's a sound. There's a sound right now. You hear it? God's already told you that there is a sound. You've already been through some preparation. It doesn't mean that you're not never going to go through preparation again. You will. Because as we grow in our knowledge of Him, He's constantly forming us. He's constantly shaping us. But the only way that you can ever make it through the preparation is when you receive the provision. Sometimes you're going to hear it long before you ever see it. I've heard some stuff about this church. And I don't know how long it's going to be before I see it. But right now, I'm learning how to run in the provision that God sent me. Let me tell you something. If I was to stand up here and I was to look down at you, I could say, you know what? It's not much. It's little. Because I'm far away from you. But the closer I get to you, you hear what I'm saying? The bigger you look, the more provision I see in you, the more I see in you. You hear what I'm saying? Don't walk away from what God has called you to do. If you went to it and you looked and you didn't see anything, go back and look again. Some of the greatest things that will ever happen in your life will happen because you went back and you looked again. Because you heard the sound and you went back and you looked at it. And you know what? Sometimes when you see the provision and if it looks small to you, remind yourself that it's all about your perspective. It is your perspective in relation to your provision. Because if I'm far off from my provision, it may look small. But it's my perspective in relation to my provision. But the closer I get to my provision, the bigger it gets, the more I see. You hear what I'm saying? The more I see in the provision, the more I can rely and get and grab a hold of my provision. You hear what I'm saying? I want to encourage you to do that. Unblock it, whatever it is. Whatever's been keeping you from, unblock it. There is the sound of rushing of rain coming in your life. There is the sound of the rushing of water coming back into your life. When you felt like you have run out, there's the sound of a refreshing coming to you. You ever listen to the sound of rain? You know why so many people sleep better when it rains? Because the sound of the rain puts you in a position of rest. Oh, come on, Pastor. The sound of rain, the sound of rushing water, the sound of flowing water puts you at rest. That's why everybody always talks about when you're in the Spirit of God, you're in this position of rest. It's because you're listening to the sound of your provision. When you're in the Spirit and when the Spirit's flowing through you, you're hearing the sound of provision. And when you hear the sound of provision, it puts you at rest. You're not worried about the 850 verses 1 because you're in a position of rest. You're not worried about getting tired of running because you're listening to the sound. You hear what I'm saying? Stand with me.